So I had been mapping old parish boundaries that summer, long-forgotten lines that once divided communities, drawn across the moors before anyone thought to name them. The work, it certainly wasn't glamorous. Long days of walking alone through bracken and mist, GPS in hand, scribbling notes on who had once owned what. But it was peaceful in a way that city life just wasn't. Out there, you could go hours without hearing anything mechanical, just the wind and some stone. By the third week, I'd reached the northern moors, somewhere between the fringes of Devon and Dartmoor proper. I was supposed to be tracing an old drover's road, a ghost path that once led cattle to market, now little more than a faint track half swallowed by grass. My tent, it was cheap, a one-man thing that I'd brought mostly out of optimism, but I figured that I could manage a few nights alone before heading back. The weather turned the moment that I unpacked though, cloud pressing low, drizzle that never really stopped. Still, it wasn't totally unpleasant. It was the kind of damp and quiet that makes you feel like you've slipped slightly out of time. By late afternoon, I found a hollow surrounded by half-collapsed stone walls and a few stunted hawthorns bent sideways by wind. It wasn't on the map, but it looked like shelter enough for me, so I set up there. As I wandered around before dusk, I noticed something curious. A single upright stone standing near the tree line, maybe 4 feet high, weathered smooth, and at its base were the oddest little offerings. Coins blackened with age, bits of ribbon, even a child's hair clip rusted shut. I had seen things like that before, especially near circles or old crosses, but there was nothing like that nearby, just that lone stone, leaning slightly toward the valley. I took a few photos, marked the coordinates, and tried not to think too much about it. I mean, superstition was definitely not my field. Anyway, the night came down quick and heavy that night. I ate, read for a while by torchlight, then settled in. I was listening to the sound of the drizzle against the tent. It was steady and close, and I must have drifted off for maybe about an hour when something changed. Not the rain and not the wind, but there was something like a pattern beneath it. That's when I realized that what I was hearing was footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, not the uneven pattern of an animal, but a careful tread, as though whoever it was didn't want to wake me. My ears filled with the thudding of my own pulse, and I laid still, listening. Then, against every better instinct, I turned off my torch and I waited. The steps, they moved around the far edge of the old wall. There was like a crunch and then a pause and then a crunch again. I could picture someone circling just beyond sight, and my mind offered explanations. A lost hiker, a farmer checking stock. But each explanation felt thin and misplaced. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, wasn't using a light too, which meant that they didn't need one. After maybe a minute, the sound stopped. I counted to 30, then another 30, and then nothing. I realized then too that my mouth was dry, so finally I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out, torch clutched tight. The beam cut across the clearing, trembling slightly in my hand. Trees, grass, the outline of the wall, my breath fogging in the air, and then something pale. At the far side of the hollow stood what looked like a horse, maybe, or at least it looked like one. It faced me head-on, unmoving. The coat was grey, not dappled or white, but flat, like unshaped paper almost. Even from across the clearing, it seemed way too tall, its head level with the lowest branches that I could see. Weirdly too, it didn't blink and didn't breathe. Its mane sort of hung straight down, motionless despite the breeze, and upon seeing it, I instantly froze. Something primal in me wanted to drop the light and just hide. There was no sound except the faint dripping of the water from the leaves now, and Then I did a blink, and in that half second, whatever that thing was, it was gone. Mind you, there was no rustle, no hoofbeats, just the empty clearing in the sense that something had leaned close enough to look straight through me. I sat up the rest of the night, way too afraid to unzip the tent again. When dawn finally came, the air was thick with fog, the grass was silvered with dew, and the offerings at the stone, I noticed that they had been moved and were sort of scattered about, ribbons gone, coins overturned. I couldn't bring myself to go near it, too. I packed and left within the hour, following the track downhill until I saw signs of the road again. My boots left deep prints in the mud, but there were others beside them, too. Sort of long, narrow impressions spaced a little bit like hoof marks, running parallel to mine for, I would guess, maybe nearly half a mile before just veering off, and I didn't follow them. When I got back to town, I did mention this to a local archivist, sort of half laughing at myself, not taking it seriously. But she frowned when I described the stone, said that it sounded like an old mayor post, apparently a marker where travelers left tokens to keep things at bay from following them home. Apparently, there were stories about this thing too, that on certain nights when fog rolled in from the coast, that something like a mare would rise from the marshes and wander the old tracks looking for those who forgot to leave their due. I told her in the end that I really didn't believe in any of that superstitious stuff, but I was unsure as to what exactly it was that I saw that night. It's strange the details that you remember about certain people, the little things that shouldn't mean anything but stay with you long after they're gone. For me, it's the sound of Jenny's shoes made on the floor of the clinic hallway, rubber soles squeaking faintly every few steps, as if her shoes didn't quite fit right. That was 5 years ago, when I worked at a small behavioral clinic in the city's industrial district. The building had once been a dentist's office, then a chiropractor's, and by the time that I got there, it had been repurposed again into what the owners called a short-term mental wellness center. It was really just a way to bill insurance indefinitely. They called it maintenance therapy, the kind of place where no one ever really gets discharged, just scheduled again and again, twice a month, forever. I'd taken the job as a psych technician because I needed the experience for graduate school. It wasn't bad exactly, just a bit sterile and repetitive. Jenny was one of the few people who made it sort of bearable, I guess. She was a few years older than me, a nurse who had bounced between facilities, quick to laugh, the kind of person who could make even the worst day seem sort of manageable. She had that sort of steady, patient kind of voice that put people at ease. We weren't close friends, but she'd sometimes offer me a ride home after a shift. I didn't own a car at the time, and she said that she didn't mind. She liked the company, allegedly. Now, one evening, right before the holidays, we both left early after the clinic closed. She wanted to stop by a discount store on the way home to look for decorations. It was already dark outside, the sky that flat, cold color before snow. The parking lot lights flickered in long rows, buzzing faintly as we went inside. Jenny filled the cart with fake garlands, tinsel, and some snowflake ornaments. I followed along, half distracted, checking the time on my phone every now and then. I still had to make a follow-up call to a patient that my supervisor had been sort of nagging me about all week. Jenny waved a hand and said, "Go do it in the car. I'll be in the line forever anyway." So I did. Her car smelled like air freshener and cheap coffee. But when I slid into the passenger seat, I noticed how meticulously clean it was. No clutter, no crumbs, nothing personal except for a small crucifix hanging from the mirror and a pair of sunglasses on the dash. I pulled up the call app, the one that we use for patients, and dialed the number. The call connected, and I started with the usual script. Halfway through, though, I realized that I didn't have a notepad to record my session notes. I glanced around trying to find something to write on. Between the seats was a small console box, and without thinking too hard, I flipped it open. Inside were a few pens, an old receipt, and a small brown notebook, the kind that you would buy in bulk. I hesitated a bit. I mean, normally I wouldn't touch somebody else's personal things, but I figured that it was probably just full of grocery lists or errands and whatnot. I told myself that if I just jot a few notes in the back and I could apologize later. I opened it to the first blank page, or at least I thought it was blank. Inside, there were a list of names written in small, careful handwriting. Each one had an address beside it, and sometimes a short phrase like green shutters, corner house, no fence, dog and yard, friendly. At first, I assumed that they were patient references, like a list of home visit clients. But that didn't make much sense because, we weren't a mobile clinic and nurses never did home calls. Curious, I flipped through some more pages. Page after page, more names, more addresses, always with those strange details. Back gate loose, parked car stays overnight, lives alone, things like this. Then, around the halfway point of the notebook, I noticed something else. Some of the names had dates beside them, written in red ink. Not future dates, but past ones. Random days or months apart even. I recognized two of the names immediately as well. They were both former patients. One had stopped showing up suddenly and the clinic had marked her as non-compliant. The other had supposedly transferred out of state. Upon seeing this, I got a bit of a weird feeling. At the bottom of the same page was another note as well. Next EL lives above the bakery. EL were my initials. I sat there looking at this thing, sort of frozen. I didn't move and I barely breathed. I just sort of stared at this small line of ink until the letters started to blur a bit. For a moment, I told myself that it had to be something else. Maybe she kept a record for safety checks or maybe it was a part of some research project. But I knew that that wasn't true. There was no research, no outreach, nothing that required knowing where any of us lived. I closed the notebook, slowly placed it back into the compartment, and sat perfectly still until Jenny returned. When she got in, she smiled and asked if I'd finished my call, and I said yes. My voice cracked a little bit when I said it too. Thankfully, though, she didn't seem to notice. She handed me a paper cup of hot chocolate that she had bought from the cafe near the checkout and started the car. On the drive home, she talked about the snow forecast, about her neighbor's cat that had gone missing last week, about how she might spend Christmas alone this year. I nodded in all the right places, pretending to listen, but I just couldn't stop thinking about that notebook. When we pulled up to my building, she smiled again and said, "See you Monday." I nodded, said thanks, and got out of the car. I waited until she drove off before running up the steps 2 at a time. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those names, those addresses, and the red-inked dates. I wanted to believe that I'd misunderstood things, but I just couldn't shake the image of my initials written there, right at the bottom of that page. The next morning, I went into work early before the others arrived. I logged into our internal system and looked up the patient files of the 2 names that I recognized. Both accounts had been flagged incomplete. No follow-up, no discharge, just ended. No one ever talked about them again either. And well, a few weeks later, Jenny suddenly stopped showing up to work. The supervisor said that she had quit suddenly, left no notice, no forwarding address or anything. Her employee email went dead that same afternoon as well. The clinic replaced her within the month, and nobody really seemed particularly surprised by it. I mean, people come and go all the time here, someone said. But, I don't know. I've moved apartments the same winter that she left, and I changed my phone number a few months later as well. But still, every single December since then, I cannot stop thinking about that notebook. There are certain sounds from childhood that just never really leave you, right? For me, it's the slow squeak of the stairwell door in the apartment complex where I used to babysit. It was always followed by footsteps that echoed just a little too long down the narrow hallway. Even now, when I hear that kind of sound, an uneven rhythm of someone walking toward me, I feel that same crawling unease in the back of my neck. So, I was 15 then, still in that weird in-between stage where you're technically responsible for other people's kids, but still young enough to think that danger is something that happens to other people. The family that I babysat for lived on the second floor of a quiet, aging complex. One of those places built in the 70s where every apartment looked the same and the walls smelled faintly like carpet cleaner. They had 2 kids, 5 and 7. Good kids too, loud but sweet. Their parents worked evenings at a local restaurant, so I'd usually show up at around 4 and stay until close to midnight. It was always the same routine. We would spend the late afternoon outside in the courtyard, then head in for dinner, bath time, and bed. The courtyard was a faded square of cracked pavement surrounded by rusted railings, with a patch of grass in the middle that the maintenance crew never really kept up with. The kids liked to ride their bikes in loops around the parking area. I would sit on the low concrete ledge near the stairs, scrolling through my phone or reading, just sort of keeping an eye on them. That's where I first saw the man, from 3B. He was tall and pale, probably mid-40s, always wearing the same faded windbreaker, no matter the weather, and he had this kind of awkward politeness about him that made it hard to tell if he was harmless or not. The first time he spoke to me, it was sort of just small talk really, asking if the kids were mine, which I thought was kind of funny. I told him that I was just babysitting, and he smiled like that was exactly what he wanted to hear. He asked about school, about where I lived, whether I was on any sports teams or anything. Then, in that same calm and almost clinical tone, he said, "You look like a runner. You've got perfect form in your legs." It didn't register right away. I remember sort of half smiling and shrugging it off, just wanting the conversation to end, really. I told the kids that it was time for lunch, and I steered them inside. And here's where I think I made my first mistake. I didn't lock the door. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the kids arguing over which color plate that they wanted, and I just sort of sat down with them at the table when the doorknob turned. At first I thought it was one of the parents. Maybe they had forgotten something. But the door swung open, and it was him, the man from 3B. He stepped in without hesitation, closing the door behind him and turning the lock with a soft click. I can still hear that sound, like a nail tapping against glass. He smiled, but it wasn't that same polite smile from before. It was smaller, tighter. "I just thought I'd stop by," he said. "Didn't get a chance to really talk earlier." For a second, my brain completely shut off. I didn't know what to say. The kids went completely quiet too, one of them holding a half-eaten sandwich in midair. Something in me shifted then, though, an instinct that I didn't even know that I had. I forced a laugh, something that I hoped sounded casual. I said that the parents would be back any minute, that they were just upstairs grabbing something. His expression flickered, but he stayed where he was, hands in his jacket pockets. I took a step closer to the door, keeping my voice steady, pretending everything was fine. He then said, "You don't have to lie, I know their schedule." The way that he said it, flat, certain, it made my stomach twist. I don't remember the exact words after that. My voice just came out faster, higher, anything that might convince him to leave. I told him the kids had to take a nap, that the building manager sometimes comes to check on them, and that there were cameras in the hallway. Lies, all of it. But somehow, it worked. He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed, turned, unlocked the door again, and as he stepped out, he said, almost to himself really, "You're smart, that's good." Then he shut the door behind him. The sound of the lock sliding into place when I turned, it felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. I double-checked every latch, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the couch, literally shaking for a full minute, before calling the kids' parents. But when I saw the time, I sort of hesitated a bit. They would still be working, and I didn't want to cause trouble or get blamed for not locking the door sooner. So in the end, I said nothing. When they got home, I smiled and said that everything was fine, and I just left. I didn't even tell my mum until the next morning, when I guess the fear finally caught up with me. She went completely pale as I told her. She called the family right away, and they called the police. Later that evening, an officer came by our house. He asked a few questions: what he looked like, what time it happened, how long he was there for. He didn't say much, but I could tell that something was wrong from his expression. The next day, Mum showed me a news article online because a man in the same complex had been taken into custody. Same age, same build, same faded windbreaker. Apparently, he had been wanted for multiple assaults across 2 states. And the police, they found something in his apartment that made my skin crawl upon hearing it. According to the report, there were like notebooks or pages and pages of like handwritten names, most of them women and girls from the complex. Notes about what time they left for work, when they were home alone, which apartments had children, which ones had dogs in them. The article said that some of the names had been crossed out in red pen, and no one ever explained what that meant to me. I don't remember locking doors before that day really, but these days I check them at least 2 or 3 times even before I sleep. I even keep a chair wedged under the handle when I'm home alone. When I was 16, there was a stretch of weeks where I just felt like I was being watched. Not in an obvious someone following me kind of way, but in that subtle, uneasy sense where every shadow feels too still, every reflection too slow to move when you do. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. My mum's nerves, they had rubbed off on me. She had been scared lately too, you see. Said some man in an old van stopped her one morning on her walk, asked for directions, then insisting that she should get in so that she could show him the street. She told him no, obviously, and hurried home, but her voice shook the whole time that she told me about it. She tried to laugh it off, but I could see that she was pretty rattled. Well, a few days later, I started taking the long route home from school. It added 15 minutes, of course, looping around the blocks instead of cutting through the narrow alley that ran between the old houses at the edge of town. The alley was just a short connector, 2 fences, cracked pavement, and a few overhanging trees that blocked the light near sunset. It was harmless, and it always had been. But after my mum's story, even the idea of walking through it alone just gave me a bit of a weird feeling. Until the day that I decided to use it again. It was one of those late autumn afternoons where the air smelled like smoke from people's backyard fires. I was tired from exams, and the sky had that flat, colorless look that comes before dark. I wanted to get home fast and make some tea, and put my headphones in and told myself that I would be fine and that I was just overreacting. The alley, it did look different that day. It always did in the colder months, really, though. The vines along the fences dried out, the wind carried little bits of paper and leaves that scuttled around your feet. There was a puddle of water at the far end from last night's rain, and the reflection of the streetlight shimmered in it, the only bit of brightness in the grey. Halfway through, I heard a car as well. Not unusual, but something about the slow and deliberate sound of the tires on gravel, it made me turn around to take a look. There was a van sitting at the mouth of the alley, beige or maybe sort of off-white, the color of an old refrigerator, really. The engine idled, humming low. Inside, I could barely make out a man's shape behind the windshield. He didn't move, just sat there. For a second, I thought that maybe he was waiting for someone. But the way that the headlights weren't quite on, dim as if turned one click below normal, made it feel more deliberate, like he wanted to see me without being seen. I kept walking, trying not to look nervous, but my hands were definitely sweating, and my heart felt too loud in my chest for sure. The van, it rolled forward, slowly. I pulled out my phone, an old flip-style one, barely working, and pretended to talk on it. I didn't even have service out there, but I started muttering like someone was on the line, and I forced a laugh and said, "Yeah, I'm on my way home now," into the empty air. The van, though, it crept closer. I could see him now more clearly, and he was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, greyish hair, pale face. He rolled down the window halfway and said, "Hey, could you help me find a street? I just need some directions." His tone was friendly, practiced almost, like someone who had rehearsed it 100 times by now. I told him that I didn't know street names, tried to keep walking. He didn't leave. "Come on," he said, "just 1 second." I felt my throat close. His eyes flicked to my phone and then back to me. The expression that he gave wasn't frustrated or angry, it was more like calculating and cold. Something in me broke then too, the false calm, the pretending, and I turned and I instantly ran. Not a jog too, but a panic sprint. Something in between, fast enough that my bag slammed against my side and my breath caught in my chest. I didn't stop until I saw the open road at the end of the block. When I turned back, the van was gone. I told my mum that night, and she didn't believe me. She said that I'd been spooked because of what happened to her and that I must have made it up, probably to get attention, she said. She even had her boyfriend walk me to school the next day, just to prove that nothing was out there. When nothing happened, she gave me that look, the kind that says, "I told you so," and so I just dropped it. But a few weeks later, something else happened. So I overheard my mum talking on the phone late one night. She thought that I was asleep, but I could hear her through the wall, and she was whispering. She said that the police had come by her work that afternoon, asking about a van that matched the description that she had given before. Pale, beige, older model, partial license plate starting with 7LX. They had apparently found it, abandoned, on the outskirts of town, near an access road that led into the woods. Inside were boxes of women's clothing and a camera. The officer told her that the clothing seemed to match mostly women, but also a few teenagers. And it was soon after this that Mum moved us out, only a month later. Said that it was because her job was relocating, but I knew better than that. Years later, whenever I walk anywhere alone now, even across a parking lot, sometimes I feel that odd sensation again, like someone's watching me. I always turn around and obviously no one's there, but that anxious feeling is truly something horrible, and I really hope that none of you ever have to experience it. So I started walking the park trail near my house a few years ago, mostly to clear my head after work. It wasn't a fancy place by any means. A few soccer fields, a playground, and a long gravel loop that curved behind a wooded ridge before winding back to the parking lot. But it was quiet, and in a small town like mine, quiet was pretty hard to come by. For months I would walk it nearly every morning before the day got too hot, and sometimes again just before dusk as well, but it became a part of my routine really. A way to think, to unwind, to feel like I was doing something good for myself. I would see the same joggers, a few dog walkers, even a group of older men who played cards by the pavilion every morning like clockwork. I thought that I knew that park better than anyone. But the last few weeks, something about it had started to feel a bit different. It wasn't anything obvious too, just a bit of a shift. Like I would catch the faint sound of someone walking behind me, turn and find no one there. Once I could have sworn that I heard whispering, quick and sharp like a radio flicking on for about half a second, just as I passed through the bend behind the hill, that is. I brushed it all off. I mean, you can walk through a forested park alone and not get spooked by the occasional trick of sound or shadow, and I told myself that enough times to believe it. Now, the morning of the event, the air was still a little bit cool. Sunlight was pouring down through the gaps in the trees. I remember noticing how the dew clung to the grass along the slope there, how it shimmered in the light beautifully. Everything felt calm again, and I thought that maybe I had just been overthinking things the past little while. There was a man ahead of me on the track, walking slow, hands buried deep into his hoodie pocket. I didn't think much of it. I mean, plenty of people dress oddly for the weather, until I noticed that he was wearing black from like head to toe, a thick hoodie, black jeans, and even some gloves. It was already warming up by this stage, nearly 20 degrees Celsius. His outfit looked heavy, deliberate. He certainly wasn't exercising, just walking slowly. I hesitated, letting my pace drop a bit. I watched him take the curve up near the hill, the section where the track dips low and you're sort of boxed in by trees on one side and a steep grassy rise on the other. Once he disappeared behind the hill, I didn't see him again. A minute later, though, I rounded the same bend. He was gone, and he wasn't walking ahead, not resting near the benches or anything. I mean, he was just gone. The only sound was the distant hum of a leaf blower from the soccer fields above, and the faint rustle of something moving in the woods. I told myself that maybe he had gone up the slope there or cut through the trees to another path or something, though I knew there really wasn't one. Still though, I didn't want to look like a paranoid idiot peering into the forest at nothing, so I kept walking, and that's when I caught it. Movement in the corner of my eye, a shape behind a tree. He was there, standing halfway down the wooded slope, his body sort of half hidden by the trunk that he was hiding behind, seemingly watching me. He wasn't moving, not even shifting his weight, just standing dead still. The sunlight didn't quite reach that far, and his clothing made him sort of blend into the shadows. I only just noticed the faint shape of his face, in fact, pale against the dark. We locked eyes, or at least I think we did. My entire body went still and cold. I didn't say anything, didn't even think. I turned and started walking quickly back toward the parking lot, my breath shallow and my vision narrowing to the path ahead of me. Every sound behind me felt magnified. The crunch of the gravel, the snap of a branch. I couldn't tell if they were mine or his, too. I grabbed my phone and called my boyfriend, but the call didn't go through. Service always dropped in that back corner of the park, unfortunately. And I mean, of course it did, right? So I broke into a run. By the time that I reached the front, my lungs were burning and the park was almost empty. just an older man near the pavilion tossing breadcrumbs to some ducks there. I blurted out what had happened, pointing back to the trail. He looked where I was pointing and then chuckled. "Yeah, well, squirrels get pretty big this time of year," he said, like I told him that I'd seen a ghost or something. But when I turned back, the man in black was there again, standing at the far end of the path, maybe 100 meters away, still watching me. I didn't even stop to think. I sprinted the rest of the way to my car, slammed the door, and instantly locked it. My hands, they were shaking so hard that I dropped the keys twice as I was trying to get in, and I saw a silver sedan pull out from the trees only a minute later, circle the lot slowly and park 3 paces down from me. The driver had a similar black hoodie, same stillness, and never got out. Just sort of sat there, looking at me. My boyfriend, he arrived 5 minutes later, just as I was debating whether I should drive straight home and call it a day, and I was crying and trying to explain what happened, but before I could even get the words out, the sedan pulled forward, creeping past us. The man glanced out the window as he passed, and I swear that he was smirking, then drove back down toward the hill where the other person that I had seen was, and disappeared down the service road that looped behind the woods. We did call the police in the end, and they took my report but didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some guy walking, one of them said, maybe taking photos. And so they never went looking for him. That night, I couldn't really sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same event happening in my head. The trees, the angle of his head, the way that he had just stopped existing for a minute before reappearing somewhere else like that. Like he hadn't walked through space at all and just sort of stepped between 2 points. A week later, I drove past the park on the way to work, and it just doesn't have the same appeal like it used to for me. I haven't gone back there, and to be honest, I think I'm going to look for a new place to start my routine again. I don't really talk about this often, maybe because every time that I try, I feel like there's a hole in the middle of my mind where the ending should be. It's not that I forgot, but it's more that something took the memory, like pulling a single thread out of a sweater and leaving only the empty weave behind. This happened in the early years after college, when I was still idealistic enough to think that I could fix the world if I just cared hard enough. That's what led me to join a crisis hotline as a volunteer. The training was long, draining, but very meaningful. 8-hour Saturdays spent practicing empathy until it genuinely felt mechanical. But I was young and earnest, and every call mattered. Every voice on the other end was someone trying to stay tethered to life, and I wanted to be that tether. The place had rhythm, a hum of phone lines, quiet tears in the break room, the low murmur of people trying to talk someone back from an edge. It certainly wasn't glamorous, but I did love it. I loved the sense that I was part of something sacred, something helpful. And that's where I met him. His name was Raymond. He was older, maybe late 50s, and one of those people that everyone seemed to know. He'd been with the hotline for years at this stage, the kind of veteran whose name carried weight. A former paramedic, recovering alcoholic, a savior type, as people said. Everyone adored him. He was loud, funny, the first to make you coffee on a rough night. And I trusted him completely. After a few months, he started chatting with me during breaks. Little conversations at first, nothing strange. He told me that he lived once with 2 dogs in the suburbs and that volunteering had kept him alive. When he asked if I could watch his dogs one Friday night while he went to a veterans banquet, I pretty much said yes without a second thought. His house was nicer than I expected too. Neat, quiet, maybe too quiet in fact. He greeted me at the door with two friendly labs who bounded toward me like they had known my name forever. Everything also smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something else as well, like candle wax or something maybe. In any case, he gave me a quick tour, friendly as ever, explaining the dog's routines, and then, just as I thought that he was about to leave, he said, "Come on now, I'll show you the upstairs." I hesitated a bit. I don't really need to. It'll just take a second," he said. "It's easier to see where things are if the smoke alarms go off or something." So I followed him. The upstairs hallway was dim, carpeted in dark green. His bedroom door was half open. Inside, soft light flickering, candles, a half a dozen at least. The air smelled thick, sweet, and he stepped in and said, "This is where I crash after long shifts," smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. His bed, it certainly dominated the room, huge and low, covered in black and burgundy sheets. The curtains were drawn tight, even though it was still daylight outside. He sat on the edge of the bed, gesturing for me to come closer. "You ever get lonely doing this work?" I laughed, nervous, light, hoping that it would diffuse whatever was happening here. Yeah, sure, sometimes." "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." Then he leaned forward a little, still smiling, but there was something off about it, something unrecognizable flickering beneath the charm. I backed up a bit, muttering something about checking on the dogs. He stared at me for a second, then said flatly, "You should go if you're uncomfortable." I thought that he meant go downstairs, but the way that he said it, cold, measured, made my skin crawl. He left soon afterward, muttering something about picking up his uniform from the cleaners. The house was silent again. Well, except for the clicking of the dog nails on the tiles. That's when things started to blur a little bit for me. It was around 8 o'clock. I must have decided to head home, and I walked to the front door and reached for the lock. Only there wasn't a key, and it was not on the table, not by the door, not on any hook, and I checked my bag, my pockets, but there was nothing. I called him. He picked up immediately. "Hey, Raymond, I think you forgot to leave me a key." There was a pause, then a cheerful, "That's right. I locked the outside deadbolt. You can get out through the garage, though. All you have to do is just hit the button. It'll close on its own." I didn't like how calm his voice sounded, but I laughed awkwardly and said, "Okay, thanks," trying not to sound uneasy. I opened the garage door and stepped out with the dogs, hit the button to close it behind me, and it rose right back up again. It was a motion sensor, which meant that it wouldn't shut. I remember standing there, sort of watching the door stutter halfway down before reversing over and over again. The dog started whining and circling me, and I felt suddenly like an ache building in my throat, the kind that comes before tears, and when I called him again, he didn't answer. And that is where my memory ends. I remember crying into the dog's fur, whispering that it was okay and that I would figure it out, and then nothing, just a black wall. No recollection of how I got home, no image of him returning, no sound of a car, nothing. Just that silence, heavy, endless, pressing against my ears, and that's it. Years later, long after I'd stopped volunteering, I got a message from an old friend from the hotline. "Did you hear about Ray?" she asked. "He apparently died. Heart attack. It was sudden." Everyone was posting tributes online. A hero, a mentor, a good man. But all I could picture was the way that he looked that night. The flicker of the candles, the way the room smelled, the hollow grin, the way that I blacked out like that. Sometimes I still think about that house, about standing in the garage again, the dogs whining beside me, the door refusing to close, and I always wake up just before I remember how I left. The strangest part, though, is that I tried to look up the address that he gave me once. The street certainly exists, but the number that he wrote down, it doesn't. In fact, there's nothing there but a vacant lot and a cluster of trees, so I have no idea what house I was actually at. And look, I know that sounds really weird, but I have checked that number over and over again, and either I have the wrong number now, or that house just doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what to think about any of this. I have no idea what happened that night, and something tells me that something happened to me, but I really don't want to think about that. When I met Owen, he was the kind of man who lived his life in definitions, an engineer, the sort who believed that everything had an equation buried beneath it. He didn't read any horror novels or care for anything that he couldn't measure. And yet, he was the one who told me the two stories that I've never been able to shake. He didn't tell them for effect either. He told them like a man describing a set of errors in a machine, things that just shouldn't have happened, but did. The first story was about his aunt and uncle, who had bought a Grand Georgian house in Wiltshire. It was a showpiece, really. Stone columns, high ceilings, a dining room large enough to hold a small orchestra, but they were the kind of people who hosted dinners with way too much cutlery and champagne that just never ran out. For the first few months, everything went as expected. But then came the odd little shifts, as he put it. The dining room chandelier would be swaying slightly when they came downstairs in the morning. Lights would switch themselves on in empty rooms. Once, they found a single place setting laid out on the table, perfectly arranged, though neither of them remembered doing it. They laughed it off, obviously. Old wiring, settling timbers, tricks of memory, stuff like that. One afternoon, though, Owen's aunt went jogging through the park that bordered the estate. It was one of those rare English days when the light makes everything seem older, like an old photograph developing in reverse. She noticed a woman sitting on the same bench that she had seen a few times before, small, pale, wrapped in a heavy wool coat despite the warmth. They nodded politely, and this time they spoke. The woman, she asked where she lived. When Owen's aunt told her, the woman's face changed. Her lips thinned, and she said, "Oh," quietly, "that house." She hesitated, then added, "Yeah, there was a family there once. The old man, he did himself in, apparently, on the dining table." It was such a blunt thing to hear in the sunlight, so ordinary in its delivery that she laughed a bit, thanked the woman, and finished her run, trying to shake it off. But she never used the dining room again after that. She said that it felt occupied, as though somebody else had quietly resumed their place at the head of the table there. Her husband mocked her for it, of course, until one night they both woke up to the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, steady, pacing the dining room below. When he went down, the house was still. No open doors, no draft, but the chandelier above the table was moving gently, swaying side to side, as though a breath had passed through the air. He left it alone, and they slept in the guest room that night and never spoke of it again. A year later, they moved. Owen said that he never really found a record of anything or anyone dying there. He looked, apparently, and checked the deeds, scoured archives, you name it. But there was one odd entry in the old land survey, a note beside the property's boundary line, written in faded pencil, "Tablestone, not to be disturbed." He told me that part like it was an afterthought, as if he had only remembered later how strange it sounded. Well, the second story, that came later, told over coffee on one of those grey afternoons where conversations drift into uncomfortable places. This one wasn't about somebody else, it was actually about his own family farmhouse, passed down through generations. In 1932, his great-grandfather's youngest son, Thomas, was struck by a delivery lorry on the main road. They said that He had apparently been chasing a ball. The boy was 10, and his father even saw it happen. Since then, a photograph of Thomas, a small sepia portrait in a cracked frame, had always sat on the mantelpiece every Christmas. No one really thought much of it too until the first Christmas after the accident, when the picture fell during supper. The sound was sharp, sudden, glass shattering mid-laughter. His great-grandmother wept, and they took it as a sign that he was still with them somehow. But the picture, it fell again the next year, and the next, always on Christmas night, always without anybody touching it. They even nailed it down once, determined to prove a point, but the next morning, it was lying flat on the hearth, nails bent like they had actually been pried loose. "It's tradition now," Owen said dryly, stirring his coffee. "They just set it on the floor before dinner every time." He said it like a joke, but there was something in the way that he looked past me when he spoke, like he was remembering something that he didn't want to. I asked if he had ever seen it happen himself, and he nodded once. "Yeah, when I was 16. It didn't fall, it just sort of, tipped over, slowly, like somebody was setting it down. It was weird." He never liked to talk about ghosts or superstitions. We dated for another year before things fell apart, but sometimes when I think about him, I wonder how much he ever really told me. There was something behind those stories that always felt unfinished, as though he had given me the versions that still made sense to him, but nothing more. I looked up the Wiltshire house once, just out of curiosity, and it is still there, beautifully restored, listed for sale, in fact. The photos, they showed the grand dining room flooded with light, but in one picture, I noticed something faint in the mirror above the mantel, a pale shape at the edge of the frame, easy to miss unless you're really looking for it. I don't show that photo to anyone, really, but sometimes I open it at night, zooming in closer and closer until the pixels sort of blur, just to see if I can convince myself that it was a trick of the light. But no matter how much I tell myself that, I just can never shake the feeling that whatever Owen's family tried to forget, the table stone, the fallen frame, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, they all came from the same place. Something that watches them, and something I genuinely believe is real. When we landed in England that November, the location felt older than anything that I'd ever known. Cold, deliberate, and just unending. We weren't supposed to stay in London that night. The plan was to take the train straight back to Bath, but a delay forced us to find a place nearby. My girlfriend scrolled through hotels on her phone, and when she showed me the photo of a brick townhouse lit by amber lamps and shrouded in mist, I told her that it looked perfect. She laughed. "You'll say that about anything with peeling paint." Maybe she was right. Old places have always felt aware. Not haunted exactly, but as if the walls remember things that we're not meant to know. I've always found that interesting. Anyway, the cab dropped us in a narrow lane between two pubs. The hotel had no real sign, just the faint outline of letters long painted over. Inside, the man at the front desk greeted us with an accent so gentle that it almost didn't sound real. He handed me a brass key attached to a heavy key tag that read, R. Moreland, 3rd floor. The corridors were claustrophobic, let me tell you. Walls bowing inward, wallpaper yellowed to parchment. The air smelled faintly of dust and lavender. Every few steps, one of the floorboards released a sort of tired sigh, like the building was exhaling around us. When we reached our door, the handle turned a bit reluctantly. The room was smaller than I expected. Rich wooden panels, a fireplace with soot still in the grate, a canopy bed dressed in crimson velvet. A single portrait hung crookedly on the far wall. It showed a man with dark hair and a sharp mouth, pointed in that sort of strange flat way that made the eyes feel too still. Cozy, my girlfriend murmured, dropping her bag and collapsing onto the bed. And within minutes, she was asleep. I stayed awake though, brushing my teeth in the tiny bathroom sink, when movement flickered in the corner of the mirror. Not fast, but just enough to make me glance back into the room. There was someone standing by the bed. At first I thought I was looking at a reflection, mine in fact, maybe distorted by the glass, but this man was taller, broader, and he wasn't moving like a reflection would. He was facing my girlfriend, leaning forward slightly as though studying her. He wore a long dark coat and a white shirt that looked impossibly clean, with lapels that belonged to another century. His hair was wavy, the kind of style that you only see in paintings. I sort of stood there, toothbrush hanging from my mouth. He wasn't translucent, mind you. There was no cinematic glow or anything like that. He looked like a regular person, solid and alive. And yet there was something deeply off about him, like a person performing the idea of being human. When I finally stepped toward him, my legs trembling, he didn't react. He didn't even seem to breathe. Then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he just sort of disappeared right before my eyes. No footsteps, no sound, nothing like that. It was like he blinked out of existence. I checked the door, it was locked from the inside. The windows, they didn't open wide enough for anyone to slip through. I began to panic a bit at this, and I turned off the bathroom light and I crept into bed. My girlfriend, she stirred but didn't wake, and I lay there in the dark, eyes open, listening to the rain and the distant hum of traffic, trying to convince myself that it was a trick of exhaustion. Sleep didn't come easy that night, too. At some point, I must have drifted off, though, because when I woke, the fire had gone out and the air was so cold that it hurt to breathe. The clock on the nightstand said 2:11 a.m. Something in the silence, though, felt wrong. My girlfriend was still beside me, but the portrait on the wall, it wasn't the same anymore. The man's head had turned. His gaze was now fixed directly on the bed. His mouth was parted just slightly, like he had been caught in the middle of whispering something. I sat up so fast that the mattress groaned. The cold was unbearable now, too, pressing against my chest. I switched on the lamp, and there was no change. The portrait stayed exactly as it was. And then, faintly from behind the bathroom door, came the sound of running water, slow and steady. I wanted to wake her, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. Instead, I forced myself toward the sound, one slow step at a time. The bathroom light flickered on and off, casting long shadows through the room. The tap was open, but the sink was dry. There was no water, just the sound of it, playing it, being real. That was when I felt the weight behind me. Not a touch, but more like the sense of something close enough to breathe against the back of my neck. I will never forget that feeling, too. It was truly terrifying. I turned, and there was nothing there. We checked out early that morning, and neither of us spoke much during the breakfast. It wasn't until our flight home that I told her about what I had seen, though even then it felt like I was describing a dream that I couldn't wake from. She paled when I mentioned the name on our key. Moreland, she said. You didn't read the plaque in the hallway, did you? Apparently, the townhouse had once been owned by a painter named Richard Moreland, who died mysteriously in 1812, found slumped at his easel, working on a self-portrait that he never finished. She showed me a photo that she had taken of the plaque, and the portrait on the wall, the one that turned its head, it was absolutely him. And when I zoomed in on her photo, I noticed something else strange. On the painting in the image, Moreland's eyes were not looking at the viewer at all. They were angled off to the right, as if watching something or someone. But the angle of it all, It just reminded me of that night where I could have sworn that portrait, it moved. When we first saw the house, it really didn't look like much. A sagging fence, a half-dead maple in the front yard, windows the color of nicotine. But the land was quiet, that heavy suburban quiet that feels like the world stops breathing after 10 p.m. But the land, it was quiet. We moved in during winter, and for the first few weeks, everything had that sterile sort of new routine calm to it. Boxes stacked against the walls, the air faintly smelling of old carpet and plaster dust. My wife loved it, in fact, and said that it felt like a house that just needed to be lived in again. Our son took to it even faster than her. 3 years old, full of nonsense songs and toy cars. The kind of kid who names shadows and laughs at the empty corners of rooms. Yeah, a little bit creepy, but he's ours. It started small. Him standing in the hallway between his room and the bathroom, whispering to the wall. At first I figured it was an imaginary friend thing again. Normal, right? Kids do that. He'd pause sometimes, tilt his head, nod as if listening, and then answer back with a tiny but serious okay. The strange part, though, was how fixed it was. Always the same patch of wall, about shoulder height for me, just below the thermostat, and he never changed spots, never faced another way or anything. When my wife asked who he was talking to, he didn't hesitate. The quiet man, he said. She laughed it off, said that it was probably something that he overheard from TV. I wanted to believe that too, but then came the sound. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, when I got up for water and passed that stretch of the hallway. The house was dead still, except for this faint sort of humming sound. Not electrical and not the fridge or the vents or anything. In fact, it was sort of tuneless, low, like someone murmuring behind drywall. I thought at first that it was probably the pipes, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, the sound got sort of clearer. It wasn't mechanical, it sounded a lot like breathing. I stood there for a long time just listening, the hum rising and falling. The next morning I pulled everything apart, checked the attic, the crawl space, the studs in the wall. There was nothing. No pipes, no wiring, no speakers, no way anything could be inside of it. When I mentioned it to my wife too, she sort of frowned and said that maybe the house was settling. She didn't hear it herself, and so she brushed it off, but 2 nights later, our son came into our room around dawn. He looked wide awake but calm, sort of like kids get when they're relaying something simple. The quiet man said that you can hear him now, he told me. Then he smiled like it was a good thing. I didn't go back to sleep after that. Over the next few days, odd things kept happening too. The hallway light would flicker just once when I walked past it. Never when my wife did, though. Toys that we had put away in his room would turn up sitting perfectly in the same spot by that wall, as if arranged and not dropped. Once, when I came home from work, the thermostat was running hot, 30 degrees, and I asked my wife if she had changed it, and she said no, she'd been out all day. Later that night, I stood in the dark hallway again, hand on the warm plaster, and whispered, "Who are you?" The hum, it stopped, and for the first time in weeks, the air was silent suddenly. Then, faintly, there were 3 slow knocks from inside of the wall. I yanked my hand back, and there was nothing after that. No noise, no hum, just the quiet house breathing around me again. Well, last weekend we finally decided to call someone to come and check the wall. A contractor came by, tapping the plaster with a little hammer that he had, marking spots with chalk. He said that everything looked sound. No rot, no pests, no hollow cavities or anything like that. But when he got to this section by the bathroom door, he stopped, knocked once, tilted his head, "That's strange," he said. "There's something behind here. Feels like an old cavity maybe, or maybe a closed-off alcove." He went to get his saw. My wife was already shaking her head. She did not want to see whatever was in there. When he came back, the spot that he had marked, the one that he swore was hollow, suddenly sounded solid again, like something had shifted inside of the wall. He left confused and told us that if we ever needed more work done that he would be available, but that he couldn't really find anything that was wrong. That night, my son wouldn't sleep in his room too. He stood in the hall staring at the wall again, but not speaking this time, just standing there listening, I think. I asked what he was doing and what he was waiting for when I found him there. He didn't look away when he answered too, and he said, "The man is moving to the other wall now." Well, we're staying with my brother for a while now, and I told my wife that I just needed to let the house settle, but the truth is that I can still hear that hum when the house goes quiet, and it's really starting to bother me. Sometimes when my son draws, he fills the paper with a rectangle shape too. No windows, no door, and just a wall. And inside of that wall, he always colors a small oval gray sort of smudge, like the outline of something, but I can't make out what it is. And I guess that's why I'm here too. I have no idea what any of this is, and if any of you guys have any explanation or some advice as to what this might be, how I might get rid of it, paranormal or otherwise, then I would love to hear from you. Thanks. There's a kind of silence that only exists in small towns. Not peace, but the weight of something long forgotten. I learned that when I was 9, the year that we moved into the house beside the Bells. It stood crooked next to the old church, its steeple looming over the roof like a watchful finger. My mother said that we were lucky to find a place so cheap, though even she admitted that it felt strange how nobody else had taken it. The landlord was vague when she asked why it had been empty so long. It was a duplex. Someone quiet lived downstairs, though we never actually saw them. We had the top floor, reached by a slanted staircase that seemed to tilt further every time that we climbed it. At the top, the hallway stretched wider than it should have been, a square that I swear swallowed sound. Our bedrooms branched to the left, the sitting room to the right, and beyond my mother's door was the kitchen, heavy with the smell of old wood and rain that never seemed to dry. The doors, they were the first thing that didn't feel right too. Tall, heavy, older than the rest of the house for sure, fitted with skeleton key locks and warped from time. They never stood shut. Even when latched, they would always ease open in a soft click, as though something on the other side remembered how they used to move. At first, it became kind of a game, I guess. My brother and I would race to shut them, waiting to see which one creaked open next, and it was funny until we sort of realized that they would open most often when nobody was near them. Every night after 9 too, when the church bells rang through their final chime, we would hear the stairs groan under careful weight. One step, a pause, and then another, slower this time, like somebody climbing up the stairs. Sometimes it stopped about halfway, other times it reached the landing itself, lingered, and then just sort of faded. My mother said that it was just the house, and I wanted to believe her, but the house never sounded like that during the day. Also, there was something else that happened, and it started as a drop on my arm while I was reading in bed one time. I genuinely thought that I had left the window open, but it wasn't raining. The next morning, my brother said that he had felt the same, something cold landing on his head while he was playing with his toys. It happened again and again, and always 1 or 2 drops, but never enough to trace it. We checked the ceilings, and they were bone dry. The attic, there were no leaks, no pipes, just blackened beams where a fire had once crawled and died. Mind you, the scorch marks looked old, older than the wiring or the wallpaper for sure. They sort of spidered across the rafters like veins, and when I asked about it, my mother went quiet. And that evening she told us that we'd be visiting the library. The librarian led her to a drawer of brittle index cards and microfilm reels that smelled faintly of dust and ozone. We searched for anything tied to our address, fires, accidents, deaths. There was nothing, though, as if that piece of town had never even existed until we moved in. Sometimes, too, in the middle of the night, the air would thicken with the smell of smoke, faint and distant, and not from the stove or the chimney. You could actually taste it, in fact, like a bitter edge of smoke. Then, on the night that broke everything, the church bells rang midnight early, and I will never forget this. We were asleep when the footsteps began, heavier this time, dragging and uneven. They reached the landing, paused, and then the latch of the living room door snapped open. My mother's boyfriend got up, cursed softly, and went to shut it. And he barely made it back to the bed before the door opened again. Only this time, there was another sound beneath the creak of the hinges. The soft tearing of paper or something. The faint ring of laughter as well, and it was coming from the living room. He thought that it was us sneaking out to peek at the presents under the tree, and he burst in ready to yell, but we were both asleep in our beds. He didn't tell us what he saw when he went back, but my mother said that he sat on the couch all night with the lights off, staring at the hallway. She woke once to hear him whisper, "It's still dripping." The next morning, the ornaments on the lower half of the tree were gone. Just the hooks were left swaying there, and there was a faint trace of soot or dust in the carpet. We left the following day. Years later, when I tried to find the house again, the church was still there, newer and repainted, its bell tower polished as well, but the lot beside it was now bare, grass and rubble. No sign that there had ever even been a home there at all.